Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Aleister Crowley was rarely afflicted with humility. In August of 1920, at the age of 44, having used his authority as a master of the temple and a supreme and holy king of the Gnosis to set himself up as the sacerdotal father of the little abbey of Thelema in Cefalù, Crowley naps through a windless August afternoon. He then embarks on his evening with 3 doses of heroin and 2 of cocaine. These do not lift his heavy spirits, but they inspire in him a vision of Calvary with himself on the cross. In his magical record, he inscribes this reverie with heroin profundity and cocaine prolixity. He writes, "Thrust through my hands are spikes, thou canst not do, thou canst not hold, thou canst not go. My thoughts, sharp, tough, and smooth, their tangle for all its complexities closed in a circle. These are the thorns of my crown. My body's weight, dull agony, stark shame, loathed impotence. My throat's thirst, love. Quenchless art thou, O love, alas, 7 times, alas, and alas." He continues in this vein at great length, coming with time to engage in a repartee with the nameless soldier at the foot of the cross, who eventually answers him. "What virgin hath wiped thy face? Who hath been Asia to thy Prometheus? Whom hast thou wooed nigh 40 years, nor slackened suit? Whom hast thou won again and again, and yet tonight wouldst win? Who hath displayed to thee most her beauties? Who hath seduced thee most? Hath borne thee sons and daughters most? Who hath been subtler and lovelier? Who hath more music or might? Thy virgin, thy true love, and thou, her chosen above all men alive, the English language." Well, Aleister Crowley was a man miraculously manifold. Occultist, chess player, mountain climber, drug experimenter, guru, spy, prophet, and apocalyptic beast. But encompassing and above these in many respects, he was a writer. In his time, he wrote nearly everything a writer might write. Poetry, plays, philosophical essays, novels, short stories, song lyrics, film treatments, recipes, rituals, and reams of correspondence. And even for those most deeply initiated into his systems of magic and mysticism, our chief contact with his work and thought is through his writings. These are notoriously dense. They have a well-earned reputation for difficulty, and a still-growing body of secondary works by later authors purports to popularize the teachings they comprehend. In this talk, I hope to supply some tools to help potential readers encounter Crowley's own writings and come to a more rapid and full understanding of these often complex and layered texts. That is, I'll point out some of the Crowley codes and indicate where their keys can be found. Before moving into the technical occult writings for which Crowley is famous, and which are, in my opinion, pretty much peerless, let's pause to consider his literary output for more general audiences. Crowley was an accomplished poet and essayist. He wrote some excellent short stories and several novels. Many of these address magical and mystical themes, but only rarely with supernatural elements. After all, Crowley was a professed atheist whose scientific illuminism aimed to fulfill the natural potentials of the aspirant. God was for him an expressly rhetorical construct. He had studied too many religions too closely to imagine any correct metaphysical sense of that word, or to have faith in any popular sort of supernaturalism. And his most famous novel was Diary of a Drug Fiend, which made a roman à clef, a novel with a key, out of his Cefalù episode. Nothing supernatural happens in it at all, but it contains a significant narrative exposition of his central philosophy. As it happens, I read an online review in which the reviewer expressed frank horror that the ultimate goal of the book's drug takers should be conscientious, controlled use of the drugs that had previously dominated them, rather than abstinence in recovery. It is probably worth remarking, by the way, that Crowley did himself kick his heroin and cocaine habits. While it is common knowledge that he died addicted to heroin, his misery in this regard is typically overestimated. He died in very comfortable circumstances, well looked after and frequently visited by friends. His regular doses of heroin at that time were according to a doctor's prescription, as a substitute for the asthma medicines that were no longer available from Germany because of World War II. Perhaps my favorite fiction by Crowley are the stories called Golden Twigs, which he wrote under the inspiration of J.G. Frazer's Golden Bough, the groundbreaking global ethnography of magical beliefs. These, and all of Crowley's short fiction, are available today in 2 affordable volumes published in paperback by Wordsworth. There is a lot of Crowley poetry. Some of it, not nearly all, is sublime. When he was only 30 years old, he had the audacity to publish his 3-volume Collected Works, which was mostly poetry and plays in verse. Of course, his best poetry was written later in life, but his early poems, The Neophyte and The Quest, were featured in the Oxford Book of Mystical Verse. Traditional poetic forms are themselves something of an alien code to many 21st century readers, but Crowley's better poetry, even while it might include esoteric symbolism, is generally not didactic. Its value is in its images, its sounds, and its stories. And that brings us to his writings that are overtly instructional. His earliest technical writings on magic were in the volume called Kongs om Pax. In this title, we can already sample Crowley's obscurity. Kongs om Pax were allegedly the words of dismissal after initiation in the ancient mysteries of Eleusis, and they were used in the ceremonies of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a Victorian magical order of which Crowley was an initiate. In that context, they were presented as a Greek corruption of the Egyptian Kabs Am Pekt, meaning light in extension. But nowhere in Crowley's book will you find this explanation of the title. In the dedicatory essay of the book, he writes, "I hear somebody exclaim, 'This man was obscure enough before, but now, very like, 'tis the first time I have written careless of lucidity.'" Perhaps so, but it was not nearly the last. Later, reflecting on his repeated failures to communicate his essential points in works of magical instruction, Crowley noted his own chief vice as a writer. He loved to write as though the reader had access to everything that he himself knew, except for the one thing that he wanted to present in the document at hand. Crowley, as Martin Starr has remarked, is his own audience in his texts. This admittedly perverse and counterproductive habit makes his writings difficult of access, but exciting for readers who want a challenge, and rewarding for those willing to return to them after further education and life experience. He tried various strategies to mitigate this vice, chiefly the use of amanuenses and correspondence, whose particular limitations of understanding could remind him to keep his foot off the accelerator, as it were. His final book on magic, with the working title Aleister Explains Everything, took the form of actual letters to a beginning student. It was published as Magic Without Tears, and thus continued the ambition he had first expressed in the opening pages of Kongs om Pax to have Kongs om Pax replace Reading Without Tears in every infant school. In Kongs om Pax, Crowley mixes genres in selections under a single cover: poetry and prose, philosophical dialogue, and esoteric allegory. He would later continue this approach in his massive periodical, The Equinox, where a considerable proportion of his magical teachings were first published. The expense of Equinox reprints and the frustration for occult students to skip over materials included as bait for a more general readership have resulted in abridgment efforts. The first was the single-volume Gems from the Equinox, edited after Crowley's death by his former secretary and magical pupil, Israel Regardie. This book is still available and very useful indeed. More recently, the U.S. Deputy Grand Master of OTO, Lon Milo Duquette, has edited a digest series to collect papers as the best of the Equinox. according to distinct occult subject themes, such as Enochian magic, dramatic ritual, and sex magic. Also, the OTO has continued the original Equinox, currently in its 4th series, as a vehicle for issuing definitive editions of significant Crowley works, some previously unpublished. Before I embark on a quick survey of the Crowley Codes, I need to add one more cornerstone work to this conversational bibliography. And that is the book numbered 4, also known as Liber ABA, or simply Magic, and fondly in its single-volume editions as The Big Blue Brick. This book has 4 parts, 1 on mysticism and yoga, 1 on magical symbolism, 1 on magical theory and practice, and 1 on Crowley's religious revelation. It is unquestionably his magnum opus, a central reference for students of his work capable of sustaining a lifetime of study. So, on to the codes. The first and most important of the Crowley Codes is English. Now, you may have noted that my own diction can be a bit too erudite, even a bit sesquipedalian. Like Crowley, I loathe to talk down to people, but it's easier to follow unfamiliar language when reading an author such as Crowley, because you can use a dictionary. Crowley himself habitually read with a dictionary at his elbow. It hardly occurred to him that any serious student would do otherwise. Our own pandering mass media inculcate laziness, where we assume, usually correctly, that we can infer the meaning of unfamiliar words from context without losing the main thread of a discourse. In a Crowley text, on the other hand, if there's a word you don't understand, it's probably necessary to the larger passage. And why pass up the opportunity to learn a new word? Remember, grimoire is originally just grammar. The second code is, and please don't be upset about this, but it's the Bible. With his upbringing among the ultra-Protestant Plymouth Brethren, Crowley was, quote, deprived of all English literature but the Bible during the whole of his youth, unquote. He later bragged that he had developed in boyhood and retained to adulthood the ability to find nearly any verse in the Bible quickly without the aid of a concordance. The Bible is the literary infrastructure of Crowley's thought. He claimed, quote, an intimate knowledge of the Bible so deeply rooted that it seems hardly unfair to say that it formed the whole foundation of my mind, unquote. Accordingly, his writing constantly alludes to biblical texts, but hardly ever remarks that it is doing so. Those without prior orientation to the Bible will miss many of his most important and interesting points. In the recent editions of Magic, editor Hymenaeus Beta has done a tremendous favor to the biblically unschooled by calling out and annotating Crowley's ubiquitous biblical quotes and paraphrases. Just the authors and works cited index in Magic shows well over 70 biblical citations or references. But in most Crowley books, the reader must catch such references unassisted. Did Crowley drop a biblical name or use an odd King James-sounding turn of phrase? Try looking it up in a happily searchable online Bible. And even with editorial helps, to appreciate the allusion may require studying the relevant Bible passage, understanding its original context, and even the history of its interpretation and or ceremonial use. The third code is where things start to get a little exotic. Here we have the whole panoply of Hermetic correspondences. Crowley wrote about his first initiation in the Golden Dawn, how dismayed he was to be given the Hebrew alphabet and instructed that he must keep it secret. Even so, those 22 letters became one of the secret codes that would pervade his later writing, often without notice to the reader. The 22 chapters of Magic and Theory and Practice, the 22 secret instructions of the Master, The 22 verses of the Book of the Gate of Light, and many others, are all constructed on the basis of the Hebrew alphabet and its correspondences to the trumps of the tarot, the paths of the Tree of Life, and so on. There is even Libertov, a technical paper about magical initiation that consists of nothing other than the Hebrew alphabet arranged on a page with annotations indicating the triadic structure of mystical attainment. In addition to that key of 22 letters, Hermetic correspondences include a key of 10 emanations, their combination with the 22 letters in the 32 paths of the Kabbalistic tree, the 12 signs, 7 planets, and 4 elements, and all manner of interrelationships among these. Crowley's book 777 provides a master index to all of these correspondences. But simply finding items in the tables of 777 only assists a reader who already apprehends the systems and structures of Hermetic symbolism, so that a reference like 777 can show you the shapes of these keys, but in order to apply the keys to the codes, you must first build them up in your own mind and memory. Connected with these correspondences is the practice of gematria, according to which words in Hebrew or Greek are converted to the numerical values of their letters and added up to produce significant numbers. The key work by Crowley in this regard is Sefer Sephiroth, usually bound together with 777. It is a list of Hebrew words and phrases with their translations, all arranged by numerical value. Names and numbers all mutually reference each other according to the scheme of gematria, and Sefer Sephiroth does work for point references, as well as telling you 2 different ways to make Aleister Crowley add up to 666. The 4th Crowley code has to do with the grades and degrees of the initiatory systems in which he operated. The foremost of these is the AA, which he created with George Cecil Jones as a successor order to the Golden Dawn. Like the Golden Dawn, it involves a system of 11 grades, based on the emanations of the Kabbalistic tree. AA is not a lodge-based system, though, and it goes much further in demanding real mystical and magical attainment, even in its outer grades. Many of Crowley's technical writings on magic are addressed overtly to particular AA grades. For example, the Book of the Mouth of the Abyss begins, quote, "Let the exempt adept procure the prolegomena of Kant." In this case, exempt adept is specifically the 7=4 grade of AA. So while it may be interesting to read such instructions, one might not expect to fully grasp or implement them unless one were of the indicated level of spiritual development, having undertaken the necessary training and accomplished prior tasks. But the most important AA materials in all grades have been published. As a slogan of that order declares, "Mystery is the enemy of truth." The grand map of the AA grades, with their sequence, requirements, and powers, is contained in a paper called One Star in Sight, which is in the appendices to Book 4. Oftentimes in explanations, especially in his earlier works, Crowley refers to grades and rituals of the old Golden Dawn, often with the same numbers or titles as are used in AA, but these are not the same, and readers should be careful of the distinctions between them. Crowley was also the second head of OTO, an order developed out of esoteric Freemasonry to serve as the traditional custodians of a supreme magical secret. Even under the administration of Theodore Royce, the original head of OTO, Crowley had been charged with revising the rituals to make their relationship to the supreme secret more accurate and effective. OTO is a lodge-based system with customary Masonic-style provisions for the secrecy of its rites of admission and advancement, and its most important papers have not been published. However, Crowley makes frequent reference to OTO degrees, especially in Magic in Theory and Practice, with remarks such as this, quote, These, as initiates of the 7th degree of OTO are aware, mean more than appears, unquote. Such remarks may be of assistance to actual initiates of the degrees referenced in understanding their own initiations. Otherwise, they serve only to titillate the uninstructed reader, perhaps cultivating an appetite for the mysteries implied. Unfortunately, such appetites have led to occasional efforts to pirate and expose the ritual texts of initiation. These often inaccurate and partial documents do not confer initiated knowledge, and do not help in appreciating Crowley's other writings. Just as Giacomo Casanova once wrote of Freemasonry, "Whatever one does in lodge must be kept secret, but those who, in their dishonest indiscretion, have not scrupled to reveal what is done there, have not revealed the heart of the matter. How could they reveal it if they did not know it? If they had known it, they would not have revealed the ceremonies." The fifth and final Crowley code I'd like to treat in this talk is the system of classifications he devised for books and papers published under the authority of AA. There are 5 of these, lettered from A to E, and I'll take them in reverse sequence. Class E consists in broadsides, manifestos, and other public statements intended to advance Crowley's magical orders and their social objectives. Class D consists of the official rituals and instructions. I'll mention here an interesting feature of Crowley's ritual texts for individual use. They have no standard style. Some are written in the descriptive mood, some in the imperative. Some number their points, some letter them, some do neither. Some include italicized rubrics, some do not. Some allude to explanation, some supply their own commentaries. Liber Somic, for example, contains a ritual with authorial annotations and 2 commentaries. Noting all these features and more, each ritual can be found to have a unique textual style, so that when one first reads the ritual, one has already begun to enter into a specific perspective cultivated through its practice. For this reason, among others, I strongly recommend the study of Crowley's rituals through his original texts, rather than by means of secondary literature. Class C is a sort of slop category. It contains material written by Crowley or by his associates or people he liked that he thought might be of some benefit to aspirants, but he didn't want to give it any weight of authority, so he characterized the contents of this class as, quote, matter which is to be regarded rather as suggestive than anything else, unquote. Class B consists of scholarly material useful in the instruction of magicians and mystics. And finally, we come to Class A. Crowley wrote that this category, quote, consists of books of which may be changed not so much as the style of a letter, unquote. In this, he echoed and intensified a characterization of certain inspired writings of his predecessor, Anna Kingsford, which were, quote, not to be changed in so much as a single word, unquote. Like those chapters of Kingsford's, the Class A texts are typically parsed into numbered verses. In terms of genre, these texts are of the form that literary critic Northrop Frye later called the oracle. He wrote, "The oracle develops a number of subsidiary forms, notably the commandment, the parable, the aphorism, and the prophecy. Out of these, whether strung loosely together as they are in the Quran, or carefully edited and arranged as they are in the Bible, the scripture or sacred book takes shape." And indeed, the Class A literature is often collectively entitled the Holy Books of Thelema. Preeminent among these texts is the Book of the Law, Liber El Vel Legis, Book 220. The book itself provides the Class A sanction, "The stops as thou wilt, the letters change them not in style or value." And it is full of codes, but not those of Crowley's devising. "What meaneth this, O prophet? Thou knowest not, nor shalt thou know ever." He wrote each chapter in a single hour to the dictation of the mysterious Aiwass on 3 successive April days of 1904, and he spent the rest of his life puzzling over it. In his authoritative comment, He tells us, "The study of this book is forbidden. It is wise to destroy this copy after the first reading. Whosoever disregards this does so at his own risk and peril. These are most dire. Those who discuss the contents of this book are to be shunned by all as centers of pestilence. All questions of the law are to be decided only by appeal to my writings, each for himself. There is no law beyond do what thou wilt." I wish for you the profit and pleasure of reading 666, the number of the man, and the name of his house, 418. Love is the law, love under will.